Hi guys, this is Niman Kenkre for BlueFirePoker.com, and today's video is going to be a hand analysis video. There's no particular theme to it. I just pulled out some hands from my recent play that I thought were instructional and just cobbled them together, and I'm going to make a video of them. They are not necessarily going to go deep into the hands. Some of the hands will be over by the on the flop. And some will go deeper. But I think they all will have at least one point or theme that is sort of instructional, sort of subtle, a nuance of sorts that will hopefully help you guys in terms of my analysis. So this first hand, I'll get right to it. I don't know whether this will be a 1 or 2 part video. Probably it'll be 2 parts, but I pulled out a number of hands, but I don't know how long it'll take me to go through each of them. Accordingly, it will either be a 1 or 2 part series. Well, I guess if it's 1 part, it won't be a series, but you catch my drift. So anyway, this first hand is in the 10-20 game. These are all on PokerStars. Pretty good lineup here, with Zamat and Take Chip being 2 of the particularly good players. JCL87 is my opponent in this hand. He's also a good player, very good. And it is because of that I chose the line that I took, and I will explain that as I go along. Folds to me in second position. I have Ace-3 of diamonds. Obviously going to open that to 56, which is my standard. And I get called behind me by JCL, and then Scout 326 calls me in the big blind. By the way, I recently found out that Scout 326 is Roman Abramovich, which is pretty cool for me, who, for those of you that don't know, I'm an enormous EPL fan. I'm an Arsenal fan. He's the owner of Chelsea and one of the richest people in the world. So if in fact that's true, I find that pretty cool. Anyway, I flopped the world. As you can see, I flop middle pair, the nut flush draw, gut shot straight draw, and an ace over card. And Scout checks. Of course, I bet this. And if I get raised, I am going to be very happily getting this all in. I started the hand with just over 100 big blinds, and my hand is tremendous against almost anything. And when I don't think I need to explain it in detail. If I do get raised, I am going to be fist bump getting it in here. I do get called behind me, and the turn is a brick. Now, here's where I selected the line that I did. So even now my hand has much less value, being out of position with only 1 card to come, and so it's a situation in which it's going to be a little bit difficult to play this hand well against a good player, which JCL most certainly is. So the standard play would be to keep betting. You bet again on the turn, and then potentially on the river as well. However, the problem is when I do get called behind, JCL is likely to have one of 2 types of hands. The first is another flush draw, which I dominate, like a king jack of diamonds type of hand. And the second, which is probably more likely, is a pocket pair, something like 8s or something like that. So let's deal with each of those hands. The pocket pair hand is one that he's not likely going to fold if I fire a second barrel. And the reason is that there's no reason for him to just give me credit for having a hand like pocket 8's beat, especially on this coordinated board, since I could in fact be semi-bluffing a lot of things. Not only a hand like I have, as well as, all other flush draws, but I could also be doing that with a hand like pocket 4s, 5-4, things like that. As well as just, it's not a bad board for the pre-flop raiser to be multi-barreling, since the 10 overcards a lot of pocket pairs. So ordinarily, for that reason, this would be a good spot to keep barreling. However, in this case, JCL is a good enough player to know that, so I have to incorporate that into my thought process. And moreover, if I were to check here, he's the type of player that is going to bet all of his made hands, and probably most of his draws too, just because when I check here, it's usually going to be me having made a c-bet on the flop, trying to take it down, and then checking to fold. Because usually somebody with a made hand here is not going to check a second time. And somebody with a hand that has any kind of equity is not going to check a second time if they're the pre-flop raiser. So therefore, when I check, I expect JCL to bet. Now, I don't believe that check calling is really a good play here. I could have the best hand, certainly, but if I do have the best hand, I'm likely going to get barreled on the river if I don't hit. And if I do hit, and he has a decent hand like pocket eights or pocket nines or whatever, I'm not going to get any more value out of him. So basically, I'm chasing without implied odds, because if I do hit my hand and then suddenly lead into him, it's just not a very good line. And he's going to just sniff that out. And it's very unlikely that I'll be able to get in a check raise unless he had a lower flush. So, given that his most likely hand is something around the pocket eights, pocket sevens type of range, I expect that I'm not going to have fold equity by barreling a second time. B, he's going to bet this again. Now, combine that with the very important piece of information that my hand is actually very strong and has very good equity still against those hands. So I don't want to fold. Sometimes this is a leak I see with a lot of players, even in these games. If they have a flush draw, they don't fold the turn, even when your implied odds are not good. So if I see people recognize spots that are not good double barreling spots, but even in those situations they check and call. That's not very good. If you have a draw that in which your implied odds are not going to be very good, especially out of position, and it's not a good double barreling spot, there's no shame in checking and folding, and you have to do that sometimes. However, in this case, in particular with the 10 coming on the turn, because we imagine that the 10 is going to overcard his pocket pairs, if he doesn't have exactly a set of 10s, because if he had jacks, queens, and above, you expect that he would have raised pre-flop, and if not pre-flop, then on the flop, especially with scout still in the hand. And so the thing is, the 10 by itself is not going to scare him off of a single bet. However, this looks like a very, very good spot for me to check raise. Now, when I check raise this board, he's going to have a whole slew of hands that he's going to then fold, and that have me beat. And basically that involves, any 5, pocket 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, maybe ace king float, that kind of thing. And I'm going to have the fold equity, which is valuable for me because of course right now all I have is a pair of 3s. And so the point being, when I check, I expect him to bet most of his range, and then when I check raise, the overwhelming majority of his range is going to fold. Now, if I check raise and I get shipped on, obviously I'm not too thrilled. However, I still am going to have decent equity over anything he has. Any hand that he ships with, I'm likely to have 9 plus 3 more 4s, 12 outs at least, and possibly even aces could be good, and so on. I mean, I guess I could have a few board pairing diamonds might not be good, but still, I'm going to have plenty of equity. And occasionally, if he faces a check raise and decides to ship a hand like king queen of diamonds or something like that, he of course I have him in awful shape. So the point is, I'm never in disastrous shape myself. And while I wouldn't want to get shipped on, I can call it off without ever putting myself in a position where I'm crushed. On the other hand, the tremendous value is in when I check, he's going to bet most of his range, and a huge percent of that range is then going to fold because I'm representing tremendous strength. Remember, of course, that there were 3 people that saw the flop, so I bet into 2, which is going to give me a little bit more credibility. Another thing is, a check raise with a made hand is very, very plausible on this board, simply because he's going to know that I could perceive his call as a big draw. Because there's a flush draw on board as well as a very coordinated board. So if I have a hand like pocket kings or something like that, it's very plausible in his eyes for me to check raise. So for that reason, my check raise is not all that polarized, it does include a lot of legitimate made hands, so he's not going to get suspicious that I have exactly the type of hand that I have now, and he's probably going to fold it. So I hope that explains it. I know that was sort of a lengthy explanation of this, but it's a very important spot, because in these kind of spots, it's important to really pay attention to all of the dynamics of the hand, and make the right decision. And I think that a lot of people, when faced with this situation, they would either just continue to barrel, which isn't really good because he's going to call again, and then you don't know how to handle the river, or they would check with the idea of check calling, which isn't really good because you don't have implied odds when you hit your hand, unless you hit it with a 3 or something. For that, and of course, when you check call, you're basically giving up on the pot if you don't hit. So you lose out on all the times you win the pot because of your fold equity, which in this case is for the reasons that I've explained, pretty significant. So it's a small hand. It's, as you'll see here. I'll play it out here. So, oops, what am I doing? I checked it, and he bet, and now I jack it up, and whoa. So the replayer just did something funky. I don't know why that didn't show up properly. Anyway, this replayer is really flaky. Apologize for that. Basically, he bet 300 and I raised it to 900, leaving like 12, 14 behind, which clearly shows him that I'm committed to the pot, and he folded. That's another point that I'd like to make too about this hand. With my sizing, I make it very clear to him that I am committed to the pot, and in doing, when I'm not. There's very few hands here where I'm gonna be check raise to 900 and then fold. But of course, there's not gonna be too many hands that I want to put that much money in, and then commit, and then have only 12, 14 left behind to call if they're not very strong hands. That's something that a player like him is going to be able to interpret, and that's something that you should always keep in mind too. I'm basically telling him that I'm playing for my stack, because it's never a spot where if I have any kind of equity, I'm never gonna play it in a way where I put in that much and then fold. And if I had a hand with less equity, I might just keep barreling, and then of course I can fold if I'm raised or whatever. So this is a very important hand to demonstrate that principle, recognizing when you're not going to have fold equity if you keep barreling, but you will have a lot of fold equity when you check raise, and that has to work in tandem with the fact that when you check raise, you can support a shove. You can call off your hand. Obviously not thrilled to, but you're able to, because otherwise, check raising big like that and then folding for only a little bit more is no good. But for that very reason, since your opponent knows that, it adds fold equity to your play. So again, sorry about the flaky replayer. I hope the other hands are not gonna do that, but I think you guys can follow the action. So all right, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so the next hand is a very simple hand, and this is one in which I make the play that I do because of the player that I'm playing against, and it's very important to play the player, and that's what I'm going to explain here. So I open pocket fours here in the cutoff, and UCI pitcher on the button, pretty tight player, but certainly not averse to making a move. Post flop calls. Now the flop comes down queen 8-4. Obviously, I'm gonna bet this. And I get raised on a completely draw-free board. There's no flush draw and there's no open-ended straight draw. Now, those of you that watch all of my videos or have watched some of my videos have seen a hand in which I played against him, in which he raised a board that made no sense to raise, where he should be and would be calling with his entire legitimate range, and so I just floated with a gut shot. I had like 7-6 on a board similar to this, and I just floated out of position with the idea of betting the river after the turn goes check check, just because his hand just simply can't be anything, since a raise doesn't make sense. And then when I did hit like a 7 on the river, I checked and he checked back, and my hand was good. So I won't get into that in too much detail because I don't want to. I want to make this video understandable for people that didn't watch that video of mine. But in this case, he's doing the same thing. This is not a spot that he really should be raising, simply because he isn't going to be raising his, if he's got a set of 8s or a set of queens or queen 8. I mean, he never has 2 pair on this board, first of all. So he just, a raise really doesn't make a lot of sense here. On the other hand, so basically, when faced with a player like me who's pretty aggressive, he's gonna, I'm gonna fire multiple barrels. He really should be calling with his entire range that he chooses to continue on. So therefore, that makes it more likely that his raise is a bluff. So, so that's part A of the analysis. And if you were to stop the analysis there, the play for me, obviously, with a set here, would be to just call. And then I call, because he has air here, and hope that he hits a little something or that he decides to keep barreling. However, this is where I have to take my analysis a little deeper and really play what I know of the opponent. And this is where the depth of my reads, I think, tend to be better than people that rely a lot on Hold'em Manager or whatever the poker tracking software is that you guys use. Because by not using it, I mean, of course, you can have it and also really try to zero in on your reads. But by me not having the stats there for me to see, it really forces me to really, really apply myself to my reads. And one of the things that I've noticed about this particular player, and I guess I really maybe shouldn't be giving away this kind of stuff, but hopefully he's not a Blue Fire member, and if you're friends with him, don't tell him. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that in this spot, when he raises, it's almost always BS, because he's going to call here with ace queen, and he's never calling pre-flop with aces or kings and stuff, so it doesn't really make sense. On the other hand, he simply doesn't fire multiple barrels. When I call here, he's done this kind of thing before, and I'll call with a hand like king queen or something like that, and then he just shuts down and he goes check 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 check, and I take the pot down. So because of that, I'm really not likely to get a lot more out of him unless he hits something. So then your thought process might be, well, if that's true, then why not just call and let him try to hit something? Well, here's where it gets tricky. When he does make this raise, I think his hand range is tilted towards something that has a little bit of equity. And what has a little bit of equity here on this board? Well, he's never doing this raise with anything that has showdown value. So therefore, it's very likely to be some kind of gut shot straight draw. I mean, it could be a hand like ace-jack or something, and against a hand like that, certainly it's better for me to flat call. But he's going to have a lot of hands like 7-6 suited, 5-6 suited, jack-10 suited in his range. And those are hands that are pretty dangerous for me to flat call against. And given also the fact, obviously I'm not going to fold my set, but given the fact that he rarely fires again after making a move like this, if I were to call this and then any number of cards, anything in between the 4 and the queen hit, it completes some kind of gut shot straight draw, any 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, or jack. And now if he keeps firing, I may have actually slow played myself into a losing hand. So therefore, even though I almost never expect to be called here, the best play against this particular player, again, because he rarely fires a second bullet when making a play like this that doesn't really make sense, is to re-raise. And so basically, I mean, I think it's nearly impossible for him to have a value hand here, because again, if he had a set of eights and or somehow showed up with queen eight or something like that, he's well, I guess queen eight could raise, but he's just never gonna be in there with queen eight pre-flop. So if he had a set of eights, there really doesn't make a lot of sense for him to raise. As opposed to letting me keep fire. Same thing if he has like ace queen or something like that. So basically, when I re-raise, I'm almost sure he's just going to fold. At the same time, it still is the right play for protection, because it's very unlikely that I'm going to get more value out of my hand anyway, and therein lies my decision to re-raise here, which is what I do, and he folds. And so it's a simple hand. I take down the pot. But I want to add another metagame benefit of playing this hand this way. So I've explained the reasons for the play of the hand that seem counterintuitive. Again, on a board that's super dry like this, when I raise with a set in a cutoff versus button situation, it seems very obvious that the quote-unquote correct play would be to just call. And that would be the right play against somebody who I expect to barrel often, or bet thin for value or make that raise for value. But knowing this opponent, this is where you make an opponent-specific adjustment and not do that. Now, all this being said, there's another tremendous benefit for me for playing a hand like this way. It gives me the balance to make that play with air, because remember what I said earlier. His raise here doesn't make a lot of sense, because any value hand, there's no great semi-bluffing hand, since there's no draws except for gut shot straight draws, and any value hand would likely play slow on this board, because it doesn't really make sense not to, when you're if you raise, you're gonna fold out my most of my hands. I'm not gonna just make plays randomly all the time, so you're gonna fold out my hands there. But at the same time, when I detect boards like this in which these plays don't make sense, by playing huge hands with a re-raise like this, it gives me the additional balance so that I can come back over him and try to win an air versus air hand, instead of having to do something tricky like float out of position or something like that, as I had done in the hand in the other video. So in isolation, if we were to deal with this hand in a box, it's the best play for the reasons that I explained against this particular opponent. But there's also the added benefit that by playing it this way, whenever he tries to make a raise that doesn't make a lot of sense, it gives me the latitude to make more bluffs, as long as I keep my range in that spot balanced, to just come back over when he makes a raise that I sort of sniff out as not making a lot of sense. So basically, in summary, I wanted to show this hand because it's obviously it's kind of a simple hand, but I wanted to show why it was correct to re-raise in a spot where it seemed like the overwhelmingly best play would be to slow play and trap, and why that wasn't applicable in this spot. Okay, so the next hand is actually going to be sort of a similar principle against a totally different kind of opponent. And there's going to be more to this hand than that. This is a hand against the Nut Spa. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but he was a frequent opponent of mine at 5'10", and he's extremely good, extremely aggressive. But he knows what's going on. He's a very good player, knows where he is usually, and really applies a lot of pressure. So I open 10-9 suited. This is now a 5-10 game. And he calls behind. And we get a couple folds, and the flop comes down perfect. I flopped the stone cold nuts on a board that has no flush draw. So I bet and he raises me. Now, here is the difference between him and the player from the last hand. This player is going to have a very wide raising range here, and he's going to bluff a lot, and he's going to apply a lot of pressure. So when he raises here, his range is going to include queen jack, pocket eights, pocket jacks, occasionally pocket queens, though he would have 3-bet that pre-flop a lot more often. He also can have the occasional aces that he didn't 3-bet, although he is a very aggressive player pre-flop too, so aces and kings are not really part of his range. And I guess if he did have that, he probably wouldn't raise on this board, so scrap that, forget I said that. But it will also include hands like ace-10, certainly ace-10, king-10, as well as he'll, if he called with a hand like 7-6 suited, he'll make this play sometimes. With the idea of continuing to barrel when he picks up a draw on the turn. So putting a lot of pressure, because this is the kind of board that it's really, really hard for me to continue on all the way with a one-pair hand. Now the difference between him and the last opponent is that he double barrels often. And certainly for value, he's going to keep betting it. But if he had some kind of crap, he's going to fire again on the turn very, very often. So, for these reasons, and for the reason that my hand is more or less pretty safe, it's the play for me here is to just call, and it is the right play on a slow play, because the thing is, I expect him to bet nearly his entire raising range here on the turn. And again, let me give a little bit more about a read that I have on him. He makes these raises, and it's a very intelligent way to play. He makes these raises on the flop with hands that he knows are going to apply pressure to the opponent. This is a hand. This is the kind of flop that, even if I have a hand like ace queen, it doesn't going to feel super comfortable. And so when I call, he's going to keep betting, and it's going to be tough for me. So in order to be able to call down with hands, I mean, ace-queen I would likely call down to the river, but if I want to call down with hands like ace-jack and things like that here, then I need to be able to have some monsters in my range as well and not just come back over them. So my idea is that I'll call here, and if he bets again on the turn, then I will check raise on most turn cards. So I call, and the turn is a pretty bad card. Well, it's now if he did flop a set, he beats me, and if he flopped 2-pair, he beat me because he didn't start with Jack 8. So all of a sudden, all of his legitimate value raising hands are now ahead of me, because I don't think he's raising here with ace-queen. He could. It's not out of the question. It certainly is possible. But it's the combination of not having 3-bet pre-flop and then actually raising on that board with a hand that has good showdown value and you don't necessarily want to bloat the pot. I think ace-queen is pretty steeply discounted. So now I check, which I was going to do on any card. And he bets again, and he bets a nice big, confident bet into the board, leaving an amount, if I call this, that he can sort of shove the river without it being like a big overbet or anything. And so now it's a little tricky for me. Like on almost any other card, I would have, if he bet the turn, I would have check raised, and if he didn't bet the turn, I may have checked, trying to go for a river check raise, or just let out myself and go for value on the river, just depending on how the turn and river came. But on this board, it's kind of tricky, because remember I told you that he does make he is liable to make the flop raise with a bunch of stuff, like it could be something like 5-4 suited or something like that. However, if he doesn't pick up additional equity, like let's say he did it with 7-6 suited, if he doesn't pick up a 5 or or a flush draw, he's not likely to keep barreling. Also, when I call the check raise, this is obviously not a very good card for him to keep barreling on as a bluff, because a lot of times I'm going to have a queen in my range. That's going to be a big part of the hands that I call the check raise with. Plus, it's the queen of spades does not give him any additional equity. If he had any kind of backdoor draw, it didn't add to his draw. So therefore, when he bets again, it's more likely to be a more legitimate hand. Now, a legitimate hand could still mean king 10 or something like that, but it's all of his value hands are now ahead of mine, and all of a sudden I'm not just trapping here. Now I'm in a situation where I have to worry about my hand. So this is a situation in which it really doesn't make a lot of sense for me to raise him, because if I raise him, then he is going to get away from all of his bluffs, and he rarely has. He never has a hand that is going to pay me off. Like, even if he somehow played a hand like king queen or something this way, which again is very, very unlikely for him to have played it this way, he is going to get off it if I raise him here with the stack sizes that we have. So just because this is obviously a silly spot for me to be raising without having it, and also on a board without a flush draw and on that kind of board, I'm not going to just call when I call his flop bet, I obviously am going to have something pretty decent there. And if I had a hand like ace jack or something, I'm not going to raise it, because it's a bluff catcher that has decent equity to actually get to the river. So the point here now is that raising is going to be called or shoved on by all the hands that beat me, and it's going to fold all the hands that don't. And I don't have to really worry that much about protecting my hand, because if it's ahead now, it's likely to stay ahead on the river. So clearly now the correct play is to just call. The point here is that the turn card was one that changed a lot of things. It's one of the worst cards in terms of improving his mate hands. Like, not only if he had a set, but even queen jack is now better than me. And moreover, but the other factor, which I want to stress because it's an important factor, is that it was in fact the queen of spades. Notice that if it was the queen of any other queen, it would change things considerably, because it could be one of those hands that picked up a backdoor flush draw. Because he does raise the flop with a lot of BS. But since it's the queen of spades completing a complete rainbow, he doesn't have any kind of it can't be a hand that he was just messing around with some backdoor equity that now picked up a big draw. He didn't pick up any draw on the turn, which obviously increases the strength of his range, and therefore I just call here. And now the river is a king. Now, and I check, and he shoves for a little bit of an overbet. Now, here's the thing. I don't think the king helps him very often. However, this actually lets me get off my hand without really worrying about it much at all. And the reason is this. Again, he doesn't have king queen here very often, so that he's just not going to play it that way. So I don't have to worry about that as much. However, the fact that he can occasionally have it, I suppose, but when we're looking at the board on the turn, knowing that he's continuing to barrel, meaning he has to have some kind of equity, really the only hand that I can beat on the turn that he's doing, that he's legitimately betting, is king 10. And king 10 would almost certainly, having rivered a top pair hand, would almost certainly check back and instead of shoving like this. And since he would do that with king 10, the fact that the king comes and he bets anyway makes it much more likely that he has a legitimate hand, i.e. a full house. And even though I was trapping with the intention of getting his stack on the flop, the story that was told and me being able to put it together and decipher it makes me realize that I in fact can and must fold this river. So this is actually a frustrating fold, but actually not a very difficult one if you think about it. Again, when he raises the flop, he can have for value a set or two pair, and the two pair can't be Jack 8. So if he did it for value on the flop, he beats me. Now, if he did it just messing around, which this player certainly is capable of, he would have done it with a hand that can pick up some equity on the turn and then fire the turn if it picked up equity. However, the turn card didn't pick up any equity. No additional draws. Moreover, it's a really good card for my hand from his vantage point. So it's not a good card for him to barrel. Yet he continues to fire. And when I call again on the turn, he really has to worry about me having a very strong hand. Oftentimes I will have a hand like, ace queen or something like that in that spot, or maybe pocket aces or something. And then the king comes and he fires on the river, which really the king makes the one hand that I'm ahead of, but that would have given him showdown equity, and hence he would likely have checked back on the river, i.e. King 10. So really, when you put that all together, there's nothing that I beat. I may be folding to another 10-9 myself, but other than that, he's almost certainly going to have a full house in this spot. And though frustrating, this is a pretty easy and necessary fold. So I want to emphasize that I still think I played the hand very well. I think the slow play on the flop was very necessary against a player like this, and I'm doing the hands in this order so that you can compare the difference between that one and the one that I played in the hand before, where even though I flopped a set on a dry board, I actually went right back over. And I want to make sure that you guys understand the difference in the two hands. And if you don't, make sure you ask questions in the forum thread that covers this video, and I'll be happy to explain in further detail. But then when the queen came and he kept barreling, now I have to really worry about whether my hand is good or not. And on the river king, specifically that it's a king, the queen, of course, is relevant in the fact that it completed a rainbow. And when it's the river king and he shoves, I'm almost certainly lost there. So I fold, and we will go on to the next hand. Okay, the next hand is a very unorthodox hand that I would normally not play this way against many players, but this is another example of really being able to apply what you know about a specific player, and then using the board dynamic to play this accordingly. Well, not that it's not that player specific, it's more board specific. Basically, it's a situation where a bet on the river, in a situation where I can beat almost nothing, is such a polarized bet that, and necessarily so, that I can in fact make the call. So I open pocket twos in the cutoff, and it folds to the big blind, Gosu Diak, who 3-bets me. Now, the first thing to know about this is a situation where certainly I can fold occasionally, but I feel like Gosu has got a more legitimate 3-betting range, whereby he's actually 3-betting in this spot with specifically a big hand, ace king, ace queen, pocket aces through pocket jacks, or with a legitimate big hand. So he's not the type of player to splash around with suited connectors and play them this way. I mean, he'll call with suited connectors and stuff like that. When he 3-bets, he typically has a pretty big hand range. Now, if I flop a set and he has a pair, he will stack off with it. On the other hand, the other reason why I feel like I can make this call is I was reading him fairly well. I had won some big pots against him, and he was playing in a way that sort of let me get a feel like I would have figured out by the turn where I was and could play accordingly. So I think this was a profitable call, especially just in that session. Sometimes you just have to make decisions on a session by session basis based on how well you're playing and how how the flow of the game is, so to speak. So I call, and the flop is pretty innocuous, and he bets. Now here's the thing. This is where I want to talk about bet sizing. Now, in today's game, we see a lot of these small bets. Here, as you can see, he bets just about half the pot. Now, when you call a 3-bet with a pair, especially a very low pair, and obviously you don't call 3-bets with them too often out of position. If you call in position, it's pretty standard to fold to the flop bet. However, mathematically, you can't let your opponents just get away with betting smaller and smaller amounts of the flop. If you're calling hands like pocket nines and then folding to these small bets, it becomes very exploitable. You have to be able to, because if you're just folding and giving them the pot when they're only risking a small amount on the bluff, it becomes much more to their benefit to do that. And then they're only losing a small amount when you do have it, when you do choose to continue. So you have to realize, now I can't tell you which hands to do it with, and because that's a function of how well you think you play, how well you read your opponent, how well your opponent plays. But the one principle is the same, is that the smaller the bet that your opponent makes, the more you need to be calling. So your calling range in this spot has to be widened for when your opponent bets half pot as opposed to if he bets 3/4 pot. That is absolutely necessary. Now, I can't tell you what your calling range should be because, again, that depends on so many variables involving your own quality of your play, how well you're reading the game, your opponent, stack sizes, board texture, so on. But it is an absolute, indisputable truth that your calling range has to be wider when they bet smaller, and therefore that's the way to combat them, betting smaller and getting away with it, which obviously has been in vogue these days. So in this case, I decide I can call because I expect when I call on this board that more often than not, though not always, he will shut down if he's got, if he has ace king, ace queen, and let me get to showdown. And also, he may not keep barreling with, he may or may not let me get another free card. He may check, hoping that I'll bet or whatever. Although he may also check with a hand like, pocket aces or whatever, trying to get me to bite. But my intention is to call here because the board is pretty safe. It's not very draw heavy, so I don't have to worry. If it's draw heavy, this player's more likely to keep barreling, whether he has it or whether he doesn't. Especially if he does have it. But in this case, I think that he's going to check a lot of turns. And then my intention is to check back. And given that his 3-betting range is sort of puts him in a polarized situation here where he's either got ace king, ace queen, or pocket jacks plus, it puts him in a situation where I can just check back and try to get the showdown. So I'm definitely calling this half pot bet anyway. And the turn is a jack, which isn't a great card because it gives him more outs if he has a hand like ace king or ace queen. Also, it makes it that such that he would that if he did have pocket aces or something like that, he may go for a check raise, try to get his stack in here because if he bet again and I called again, so many ugly cards are going to come on the river, and then it's going to put him in a situation where he's playing a guessing game out of position. So I've seen him with a hand like aces check here, and when I bet, check shove. So this particular card makes it so that he's very likely to do that. And so when he checks here, I think that I'm getting check raised often enough. Plus, if I am ahead, I'm gonna likely stay ahead on the river, and he may just let me after having given up on it. If it goes check. If he has ace king, I've seen him just give up because I think he thinks it's hard to represent that he's got a big hand if he bets the flop, checks the turn, and then bets again on the river. Although, of course, there are times when you can do that and have a big hand as well as represent a big hand. So I think that I am going to get the showdown a winner some reasonable percentage of the time. And when you combine that with the fact that I'm going to get check raised often enough, I don't want to bet this turn. So I decided to check back. And now the river is a 9, putting a 4 straight on board. And now he bets. And now, here's the situation. Obviously, pocket 2s look like total garbage here. But here's the thing. His bet here, after I called on the flop, his bet is absolutely polarized. Because it just doesn't make sense that he would value bet here with a hand like kings or aces. Pretty unlikely even that he would value bet a set of jacks, just because if you have a set of jacks, you don't want to you get raised here because when you think about my calling range, and a lot of my range here is going to be pocket 7s, things like that. So the board is so connected and coordinated, and when you combine that with the action of my having called the flop bet and then checked back on the turn, so many of my hands are going to contain a 7 or a queen, and meanwhile his hand, like when we look at so it's my hand is a little bit less relevant, more is his hand. It just makes, like, even if he had the point I'm trying to make is, even if he had 3 jacks here, I don't believe that he would make that bet, just because he would perceive that my calling range on that bet actually has him beat. Furthermore, I think that the 3 jacks would be betting the turn, a little more often than not, because that's one that he wouldn't really have to worry about the river almost unless it was something like this. So I don't think he would necessarily go for the check raise as he would if he had aces or kings. So basically, what it all comes down to is he almost always, when he does this, has a queen in his hand. He's got ace queen or pocket queens, or he has nothing. It's almost impossible for him to have anything in between ace king and a queen, because it just doesn't make sense as a bet. So this is the situation. I think that in today's game, the good players, and Gossip Diak is certainly a good player, they've learned that to merge their ranges, and it becomes more difficult to make sheriffy calls because people's ranges are very well merged. But the way this hand played out, his hand is necessarily polarized, and you don't see that very often. Like back a couple years ago, we would see bets, river bets were almost always polarized because people didn't know how to play better, they didn't know how to merge their ranges. But in this case, and so basically your hand was always a bluff catcher, and you just had to guess, is he bluffing or is he value betting, and then call or fold accordingly. But in today's day and age, because people are more polarized, it's not as simple. But on this board, it's sort of like, because of the way the hand played, it transports us back 2 years to where the bet is in fact necessarily polarized. And if it's necessarily polarized, and we are looking at his hand range being ace queen, pocket queens, or ace king, against that range of hands, calling 280 to win 745 is a no-brainer. And so even though my hand looks like total garbage, I think that it is certainly a one that I should be calling. And I called, and in fact he did have ace king, and I took the pot, and had the added benefit that actually set him on a little bit of tilt too. I got berated, and I think he spewed off a couple more buy-ins trying to quote unquote get me. But anyway, I hope that made sense. I have a number of these hands. I actually realized that I guess about, I do take about 10, 15 minutes per hand, so so I'll be able to get a couple videos out of this. I think I'm going to wrap this one up now, and be on the lookout for a few more hand analysis videos from me. do in fact give me feedback in the forum thread, and I'll try to respond to any questions. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and that's it. This is Niman Kenkre for BlueFirePoker.com. See you guys.